In Vietnam, we're fighting a counterinsurgency. It's a whole different type of warfare. She could have probably been a movie star. She was leading this company of Viet Cong guerrillas. They were called killer teams.
April 30th, 1975, Chi Hoa Prison, Saigon. The iron doors swung open. North Vietnamese soldiers moved through corridors that had held political prisoners for more than a decade. In cell block 3, a woman named Tran Thi Nga stood in the doorway. Sunlight touched her face for the first time in 7 years. She'd been arrested in 1968, not for carrying weapons, not for planting bombs, but for being married to a Viet Cong district commander. The prison records listed her crime simply as family relation to enemy combatant. Around her, dozens of other women emerged from underground cells, wives, mothers, sisters of men fighting in the jungle. Most had never received trials. Some had been tortured for information they didn't even have. The South Vietnamese guards who'd kept them here had fled hours earlier as communist tanks rolled through the city streets. For these women, liberation meant survival. But what none of them realized as they walked into the chaos of a fallen capital was that their wartime sacrifices would be eclipsed by a different struggle, one that would unfold not on battlefields, but in the quiet erasure of women's political power during Vietnam's reunification, transforming revolutionary heroines into symbols the new government would honor in speeches, but marginalize in practice. The war was over, but for the women who had fought it, a new battle for recognition was just beginning, one that would reveal how quickly revolutionary societies could revert to traditional gender hierarchies once the emergency that empowered women had passed. January 27, 1973, the Majestic Hotel, Paris. Nguyen Thi Binh adjusted the collar of her green silk áo dai as she entered the conference room. 4 negotiating teams had assembled around a polished table. She was the only woman present. To her left sat Le Duc Tho and Xuan Thuy, representing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Across from them, American National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger conferred with his delegation. Representatives from the Republic of South Vietnam occupied another corner, their faces tight with barely concealed resentment. Western journalists crowded behind barriers, cameras clicking as Nguyen Thi Binh took her seat. Foreign Minister and Chief Negotiator for the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. For nearly 5 years, she had negotiated in this city, 201 public sessions, 500 press conferences. The Western media had dubbed her Madame Binh, treating her arrival in Paris in November 1968 as a diplomatic earthquake. Her first speech introducing the 5-point peace solution had stunned international observers with its clarity and force. French journalists wrote that she moved like a rose dancing among wolves, delicate in appearance but fierce in argument. Every Thursday, Parisians had watched her walk into the International Conference House wearing traditional Vietnamese dress, her composure unshakable, even under aggressive questioning from dozens of reporters broadcasting live across Europe and America. But the woman signing the Paris Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam had not begun her journey in conference rooms. She'd started in underground cells. Born in 1927 to a revolutionary family, she joined the resistance against French colonial rule while still a student. She'd been imprisoned at Con Dao Prison Island, enduring conditions that broke many prisoners. She organized women's networks throughout South Vietnam, coordinated supply lines through villages. She rose through revolutionary ranks not through family connections, but through proven capability under fire. By the time she reached Paris, she represented not just a government, but a generation of Vietnamese women who had fought with weapons, intelligence networks, and diplomatic strategy. The signing took 3 minutes. 4 pens moved across identical copies of the agreement in Vietnamese, English, and French. When Nguyen Thi Binh lifted her head from the document, tears streaked her face. She thought of her father, who had died while she negotiated in Paris, whom she could not visit or bury. She thought of her children, then 8 and 12 years old, raised on recorded tapes she had mailed from France because duty kept her from them. She thought of the countless women imprisoned, tortured, and killed for being wives, sisters, or mothers of resistance fighters. She thought of commanders like Nguyen Thi Dinh, who had led the Ben Tre uprising in 1960, and proven that women could command armies with as much skill as any man. The cameras captured the moment for history, the only woman among 4 signatories, sealing a peace that had cost 3 million Vietnamese lives. What the cameras could not capture was the question already forming in the minds of women across Vietnam. They had earned their place at the table through blood and sacrifice. But would peacetime honor that equality? Or would it prove temporary, an emergency measure to be quietly dismantled, once men no longer needed women to carry the war? April 30th, 1975. The iron gates of Chi Hoa prison swung open, not with ceremony, but with the urgency of abandonment. North Vietnamese soldiers moved through the corridors, calling for prisoners to emerge. In cell block after cell block, women stood blinking in sunlight many had not seen for years. Some had been held for 7 years, others for 10. Their crime reports, when they existed at all, stated variations of the same phrase: family relation to enemy combatant, wife of suspected Viet Cong, mother of resistance fighter. The South Vietnamese guards had fled hours before, leaving keys and locks and records scattered across desks. Outside, Saigon burned and celebrated simultaneously, chaos replacing the rigid certainty of war. The scale of women's imprisonment only became clear in the weeks following reunification. Over 30% of South Vietnamese political prisoners had been women. Most arrested not for taking up arms, but for being married to, born to, or related by blood to men the Saigon government considered enemies. They had been tortured for information they did not possess, interrogated about supply lines they had never seen, pressured to betray husbands they had not contacted in years. Many had never stood trial. Most had never seen legal representation. Their children had grown up in villages or been placed with relatives. Their bodies bore scars from beatings, from months in underground cells where tropical heat made breathing difficult and standing impossible. Now they walked free into a country that had changed completely while they were in prison, into a peace they had believed might never come. July 2nd, 1976. In Hanoi, the newly unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam announced cabinet appointments for the first government representing both North and South. Among the names read to the National Assembly was Nguyen Thi Binh, appointed Minister of Education. She became the first female minister in Vietnamese history, a recognition that seemed to validate the sacrifices of a generation. Western diplomats who had negotiated opposite her in Paris now read of her domestic appointment with interest. The woman who had represented the Provisional Revolutionary Government in international forums would now face the equally daunting task of creating a single education system from two incompatible structures. The challenge was staggering in scope. The North operated a 10-year education system based on Soviet models. The South had maintained a 12-year French-influenced structure. Northern schools taught revolutionary history and socialist economics. Southern school, until months earlier, had taught curricula designed by American advisors. Nguyen Thi Binh inherited two teaching corps trained in different pedagogies, textbooks that contradicted each other on fundamental historical facts, and a student population where literacy rates varied wildly by region and class. She had to unify these systems while also addressing mass illiteracy in rural areas, rebuilding schools destroyed during 3 decades of warfare, and retraining teachers whose credentials came from governments that no longer existed. Yet as she began her work, establishing teacher training centers and launching literacy campaigns that would reach into remote villages, subtle patterns emerged in the new government structure. Women held visible positions in education, health, and social welfare. Men dominated defense, economic planning, foreign affairs, and internal security. The revolutionary promise of gender equality was being honored selectively, channeling women's leadership into domains traditionally considered feminine while reserving strategic power for male control. The question Nguyen Thi Binh had contemplated in Paris while signing the peace agreement was beginning to answer itself. And the answer was more complex than simple yes or no. Women would be honored, elevated, celebrated in speeches and propaganda, but the emergency that had forced society to value them as complete equals was ending. And with its ending came the slow reassertion of patterns older than the revolution itself. The Central Committee building, Hanoi. Nguyen Thi Binh sat in a conference room where decisions about Vietnam's future were debated in measured tones and parliamentary procedure. She was 58 years old, a general who had commanded thousands of fighters across the Mekong Delta, now seated among civilian bureaucrats discussing 5-year economic plans and agricultural quotas. Her uniform bore the rank and decorations of her service, But the room's dynamics made clear that wartime command authority did not automatically translate into peacetime political power. She listened as men who had spent the war in Hanoi offices outlined strategies for rural development in regions she had fought through, village by village, knowing terrain and population in ways no policy document could capture. Her journey to this room had been written in blood and sacrifice across 3 decades. In January 1940, French colonial police arrested her at age 19 for revolutionary activities. She spent 3 years imprisoned at Cong Island, where her first husband, Viet, died under torture while she was held in separate cells. Released in 1943, she had remarried in 1945 to Nguyen Hu Tri, a farmer who supported her revolutionary work. But personal life remained secondary to the cause. On January 17, 1960, she had led the Ben Tre uprising, the first major action that would evolve into the National Liberation Front. She had mobilized 162,000 peasants in Ben Tre province, seizing control from Saigon government forces through coordinated attacks that stunned military observers. She had proven that women could command large-scale military operations with strategic brilliance equal to any male officer. By 1965, she held the rank of Major General and Deputy Commander of the South Vietnam Liberation Armed Forces, making her one of the highest-ranking female military officers in modern history. Now the war was over, and her role had shifted from operational command to symbolic representation. She served on the Communist Party Central Committee, an honor that acknowledged her contributions. She gave speeches at ceremonies commemorating women's sacrifice during the war. She sat for interviews with historians documenting the conflict, her testimony ensuring that women's military contributions would not be erased from official records. In 1981, she participated in filmed interviews for documentary projects, describing in precise detail the tactics, logistics, and moral courage that had characterized women's warfare. Her memoir, detailing the Ben Tre uprising and years of combat leadership, would become an important historical document. But documentation was not command. In committee meetings, she advised rather than ordered. Her insights on rural populations and guerrilla logistics informed policies she did not personally implement. Younger male officials, who had never led troops in combat, made operational decisions about agricultural collectivization and rural governance in regions she knew intimately. The respect shown to her was genuine, but it was the respect given to a living monument, a symbol of revolutionary heroism whose active decision-making power had been gracefully retired along with her military command. Across Vietnam, similar transitions were occurring with less visibility and ceremony. Women who had commanded district militia forces became village administrators. Intelligence operatives who had run spy networks became teachers. Combat medics who had performed surgery in jungle field hospitals became nurses in civilian clinics, reporting to male doctors. The pattern was subtle enough to deny, yet consistent enough to be undeniable. Revolutionary necessity had elevated women to roles of genuine authority and autonomy. Peacetime normalization was relocating them to positions of honor without power, recognition without independence, symbolic importance without operational control. The revolution had won, but the question of what that victory meant for gender equality was being answered. Not in speeches about women's heroism, but in the quiet restructuring of who made decisions and who documented them for posterity. December 1976, the first National Assembly of the Unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam convened in Hanoi, 492 delegates representing the entire country. Among them, 87 were women, comprising 17.7% of the body. Government newspapers celebrated this figure as evidence of women's continued importance in Vietnamese political life. What the celebration did not mention was the mechanism that had disappeared during reunification. The quota system that had guaranteed women's representation in both northern and southern legislative bodies had been eliminated, in favor of what officials called merit-based selection and national unity. Without that structural protection, women's representation had dropped from the 30% levels maintained during wartime in both regions. The quota system had not been ideological decoration. It had been practical necessity, born from decades of total war. When France fought to maintain colonial control from 1946 to 1954, Vietnamese revolutionaries needed every capable person, regardless of gender. The Viet Minh had institutionalized women's participation through formal structures, guaranteed seats in people's councils, leadership positions in the Women's Union, explicit recruitment targets for military and political roles. When the American War escalated in the 1960s, both North and South Vietnam maintained these mechanisms. The North formalized quotas in legislative bodies. The National Liberation Front in the South created parallel structures ensuring women's representation in the Provisional Revolutionary Government. These were not symbolic gestures, but force multipliers in a conflict where mobilizing half the population made the difference between survival and defeat. The Women's Union had functioned as the institutional backbone of this system. Founded in 1930, it had evolved from revolutionary cell organization into a mass mobilization network with millions of members. During wartime, the Union wielded genuine power. It recruited women for military service, organized supply networks, ran political education programs. It negotiated directly with military commands about deployment and logistics. Union representatives attended high-level strategy meetings. Their assessments of village-level support influenced operational planning. When women faced discrimination or abuse, the Union had enforcement mechanisms backed by wartime necessity. Commanders who refused to work with female fighters or officials who blocked women's advancement faced consequences, because the revolution could not afford to waste human resources on the basis of gender prejudice. Reunification changed these calculations fundamentally. The National Assembly election of 1976 proceeded without quotas, relying instead on party nomination processes where men dominated selection committees. The Women's Union remained as an organization, but its function shifted from operational mobilization to social advocacy. It organized literacy programs, ran childcare initiatives, promoted family planning. Valuable work, certainly, but work that operated within traditional feminine domains rather than challenging power structures. When union representatives raised concerns about declining female representation in government, party officials responded with reassurances about gradual progress and speeches honoring women's wartime sacrifice. The institutional teeth that had made the Union effective during wartime, the ability to demand concrete action backed by revolutionary necessity, had been extracted in the name of peacetime normalization. By 1979, women comprised 15.7% of the National Assembly, down from 17.7% 3 years earlier. Local people's councils showed steeper declines, dropping below 15% female representation in many provinces. The pattern was consistent across government levels. Women's presence decreased inversely to decision-making authority. They remained well represented in symbolic roles and service positions, underrepresented in economic planning and security apparatus, nearly absent from the highest levels of party leadership. And then came Joy Moi, the 1986 introduction of free market reforms designed to revitalize Vietnam's stagnant economy, hit female-headed households hardest. Without access to credit networks dominated by male relationships, without property ownership that could serve as collateral, rural women who had managed farms during wartime found themselves economically marginalized during peacetime prosperity. The revolution had been won through structures that elevated women. The peace was being built through market forces and political systems that quietly restored traditional hierarchies, honoring revolutionary heroines in speeches, while ensuring their daughters faced structural disadvantages the revolution had promised to eliminate. September 1977. The Ministry of Education building, Hanoi. Nguyen Thi Binh reviewed reports from across the reunified nation, each document revealing the magnitude of the task she had inherited. The North operated a 10-year Soviet-influenced education system, emphasizing collective learning and political education. The South maintained a 12-year French-American structure, focused on individual achievement and technical skills. Northern textbooks taught that liberation came through class struggle. Southern textbooks, printed just 2 years earlier, described the same historical events as communist aggression. She had two incompatible teacher corps trained in contradictory pedagogies, millions of students caught between systems, and rural illiteracy rates exceeding 70% in some provinces. The diplomatic skills that had served her at the Paris negotiating table now faced a different kind of warfare. Bureaucratic inertia, regional prejudice, and the profound difficulty of creating unity from division. Her approach demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made her an effective negotiator. Rather than purging Southern teachers, she kept them employed while establishing retraining programs that preserved their dignity and utilized their experience. She mobilized thousands of Northern educators as volunteers to support newly liberated areas, turning potential cultural conflict into collaborative nation-building. She maintained the 12-year system to avoid disrupting Southern students mid-education, while gradually introducing Northern curriculum elements. Within 2 years, she had eliminated illiteracy for 1.4 million adults, achieving a 95% literacy rate that represented one of the fastest mass education campaigns in modern history. She established boarding schools for ethnic minorities in mountainous regions, ensuring education reached beyond urban centers and lowland populations. She coordinated with the Ministry of Forestry to launch tree planting initiatives through schools, resulting in 25 million trees planted in the first year alone, transforming schoolyards into green spaces while teaching environmental stewardship. Her innovations extended beyond infrastructure. She introduced explicit gender equality policies in education, mandating that male and female students receive identical opportunities in treatment. She reformed teacher training by establishing pedagogical schools across the country, opening universities in Quy, non- and foreign language institutes in Da Nang to expand higher education access beyond traditional centers. She created career guidance programs that connected general education to industrial development needs, preparing students for national reconstruction. For the first time in Vietnamese governmental history, she appointed a deputy minister specifically responsible for teachers' welfare and living conditions, recognizing that education quality depended on educator support. Her 11-year tenure, from 1976 to 1987, rebuilt Vietnamese education from fragmented colonial remnants into a unified national system, a system that served as foundation for subsequent economic development. Yet the significance of her achievement carried an uncomfortable parallel. Education, like health and culture, was considered an appropriate domain for female leadership. While Nguyen Thi Binh restructured national education, men controlled the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Planning and Investment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Public Security. Women-led institutions focused on social welfare and human development. Men-led institutions controlling military force, economic policy, international relations, and internal security. The pattern was subtle enough to be deniable, yet consistent enough to be structural. Nguyen Thi Binh had negotiated peace treaties affecting millions of lives, commanded respect from international diplomats, demonstrated strategic capability equal to any male counterpart. In peacetime, that capability was channeled into education, a field of genuine importance, but traditionally coded as feminine, appropriate for women's nurturing qualities, rather than recognition of women's full leadership potential. When she left the Ministry of Education in 1987, she did not advance to economic planning or security leadership. She became deputy head of the Communist Party's External Relations Department, an advisory role in diplomacy. In 1992, she was elected vice president, a position of honor and symbolic importance, but limited executive authority compared to the prime minister and party secretary positions that remained exclusively male domains. Her trajectory mirrored the broader pattern affecting Vietnamese women who had earned battlefield authority and revolutionary credentials. They were honored, elevated to visible positions, celebrated in official rhetoric. But the positions they were elevated to, however important, operated within boundaries that preserved male control of strategic state power. The revolution had promised equality. What it delivered was recognition within constraints, achievement channeled into acceptable domains, symbols of progress that documented how much remained unchanged beneath the surface transformations. May 1976. A village outside Bến Tre, Tran Thi Nga walked through familiar streets that felt foreign after 7 years of absence. She was 38 years old, but moved like someone much older, her gait careful, favoring ribs that had been broken during interrogation and never properly healed. The South Vietnamese prison guards who had tortured her for information about her husband's Viet Cong unit had fled when Saigon fell, leaving her and dozens of other women to walk out of Chi Hoa prison into a reunified Vietnam that celebrated liberation. While she struggled to remember what normal life felt like, her children, now teenagers, had been raised by her mother. Her husband had been killed in 1972 during fighting she only heard about months later. She returned to find herself a widow, a former prisoner, and a stranger in her own family. Her story was not unique. Official records documented that over 30% of South Vietnamese political prisoners had been women, most arrested not for combat activities, but for family relationships. Wives of suspected Viet Cong fighters, mothers of resistance organizers, sisters who had passed messages or provided food. The majority had never received trials. Many had been tortured systematically, interrogators believing that women would break more easily under pressure and provide intelligence about male relatives. Some had been imprisoned for a decade, their entire adult lives consumed by cells and interrogation rooms. When prison doors opened in 1975, they emerged into a society that honored revolutionary sacrifice in speeches, while offering limited practical support for rebuilding shattered lives and damaged bodies. The government established veteran support programs and pension systems for former fighters and political prisoners. Registration offices processed applications for official recognition and modest financial assistance. Women who could document their imprisonment or their husband's service received subsidies and access to medical care. But resources were scarce in a nation devastated by 3 decades of warfare. Pension payments barely covered basic needs. Medical facilities lacked equipment and medications to treat torture-related chronic pain, infection-damaged organs, and psychological trauma that had no name in official vocabulary. The recognition was genuine, the support insufficient. Tran Thi Nga received a certificate acknowledging her sacrifice and a monthly payment equivalent to what a rural laborer earned in 3 days. It validated her suffering without materially changing her circumstances. What troubled her more than financial struggle was invisibility. Government ceremonies honored General Nguyen Thi Dinh and Minister Nguyen Thi Binh. Women whose names appeared in newspapers and whose achievements entered official histories. But Tran Thi Nga had been a local organizer, part of women's networks that had supplied information, moved materials, and maintained resistance infrastructure at the village level. Her contributions, multiplied across thousands of villages and tens of thousands of women, had been as essential to victory as any general strategy. Yet no documentary projects recorded her testimony. No historians interviewed her about operational details or decision-making processes. Her story lived only in family memory and village conversation, part of an unwritten history that constituted most women's actual wartime experience. By the mid-1980s, economic reforms introduced market forces that further marginalized women whose lives had been disrupted by war and imprisonment. The Joy Moi policies emphasized entrepreneurship and capital accumulation. Women without property, without access to credit networks dominated by male relationships, without the physical capacity for hard agricultural labor after years of imprisonment, found themselves at competitive disadvantage. Younger women who had not fought in the war moved into new economic opportunities. Older women like Tran Thi Nga, whose productive years had been consumed by resistance and imprisonment, found themselves increasingly dependent on children and extended family. The revolution had mobilized them through necessity. Peace relocated them to traditional dependence. Their wartime service commemorated annually on appropriate holidays, while their daily lives demonstrated how thoroughly peacetime normalization had restored pre-revolutionary gender hierarchies beneath the surface of socialist rhetoric about equality. The wives of Viet Cong leaders, whether prominent like Nguyen Thi Binh or anonymous like Tran Thi Nga, had won the war, but the peace had been negotiated by others, and the terms had not included them. August 2024, Hanoi, Nguyen Thi Binh, 97 years old, sat for an interview commemorating the 50th anniversary of Vietnamese reunification. Her mind remained sharp, her memory precise about dates and details from 7 decades of revolutionary service. Journalists asked about her proudest achievements. She spoke of the Paris negotiations, of building Vietnam's education system, of serving as vice president during the difficult transition to market economics. But when asked whether the revolution had fulfilled its promise of gender equality, her answer carried weight earned through lived experience. She had seen women mobilized, elevated, honored. She had also seen how quickly peacetime allowed society to relocate them to familiar boundaries. Once emergency no longer forced accommodation. The pattern she had witnessed in Vietnam was not unique. History documented the cycle across cultures and conflicts. During World War II, American women had worked in factories, building aircraft and ships, earning wages and autonomy unprecedented in peacetime. When soldiers returned in 1945, social pressure and government policy pushed women back to domestic roles, their wartime capabilities suddenly deemed inappropriate for normal society. Soviet women had commanded tank battalions and flown combat missions against Nazi forces. But post-war demobilization sent them back to traditional roles, while men received promotions and political positions. Israeli women fought in the 1948 Independence War, then were systematically excluded from combat roles for decades afterward. The emergency mobilized women. The resolution of emergency demobilized them. Vietnam's experience fit a global pattern, where societies accessed women's full capabilities when survival demanded it, then reverted to traditional hierarchies once threat receded. Yet Vietnam had achieved more than many nations. Nguyen Thi Binh herself had served as vice president for 10 consecutive years, from 1992 to 2002, holding substantive responsibilities in foreign relations and national policy. The literacy campaigns she had launched as Minister of Education had brought 95% literacy within 2 years, transforming women's access to knowledge and economic opportunity. Vietnamese law enshrined gender equality and property rights, employment protections, and political participation. Women comprised significant percentages of the National Assembly, local people's councils, and professional workforces. These were not symbolic achievements, but material improvements that affected millions of women's lives. The revolution's promises had not been entirely hollow, but law and lived experience remained separated by implementation gaps that statistics documented, but rhetoric obscured. Women held 17% of National Assembly seats in unified Vietnam versus 30% during wartime under quota systems. They led education and health ministries, but rarely defense or economic planning. They earned university degrees in equal numbers to men, but faced occupational segregation that channeled them toward teaching and nursing rather than engineering and finance. The Choi Moi market reforms had created opportunities for entrepreneurial women, while disadvantaging female-headed households without capital access. Legal equality coexisted with persistent wage gaps, limited childcare infrastructure, and domestic violence rates that suggested traditional gender hierarchies survive beneath modernizing surface structures. In her retirement, Nguyen Thi Binh had written op-eds in Nan Dan newspaper criticizing the Communist Party for accepting incompetent and opportunistic individuals into its apparatus, for prioritizing membership quantity over quality. The statement was diplomatically phrased, but carried implicit critique. The revolutionary ideals that had mobilized her generation, merit regardless of gender, sacrifice over privilege, collective welfare over individual advancement, had been compromised by peacetime politics that valued loyalty and connections over capability and principle. She had spent 75 years in the Communist Party. Her criticism came not from opposition, but from someone who had believed the promises and witnessed their partial fulfillment and partial betrayal. The wives and daughters of Viet Cong leaders had won the war. They had commanded troops, negotiated treaties, organized networks, endured imprisonment and torture. They had earned equality through blood and sacrifice, but earning and receiving remained separate transactions. Peacetime society honored their wartime contributions, while resisting the structural changes that would make equality permanent rather than emergency accommodation. Their victory was real but incomplete, their achievements documented in history, while their full equality remained aspirational. The lesson transcended Vietnam. It revealed how societies worldwide mobilize women when survival demands it. then spend peacetime negotiating how much of that equality they will permit to persist. Once emergency no longer forces accommodation to women's full humanity and capability.